aircraft carriers: Eagle, Hermes, Furious, and Ark Royal. The Achilles heel of this immense force was its vulnerability to air attack. Ships had been given extra deck armour and some high-angle guns, which were only accurate when a ship was not pitching in heavy seas, and which were slow firing. To improve anti-aircraft fire, the Navy was introducing the Bittern class of anti-aircraft sloop, equipped with 3 twin 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and new fire control systems and stabilizers. The Bittern class represented a quantum leap for the Royal Navy in anti-aircraft capability, but there were only 4 in service. Britain's carriers, which could launch only 150 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers or Blackburn Skua dive bombers, could provide little protection. Moreover, only the RAF's Bristol Blenheim could reach Norway from British bases. The 5 infantry brigades earmarked for Scandinavia were from the Territorial Army. In 1939 it had been doubled in size. Battalions had been split in 2 and brought up to strength with raw recruits. Efficient battalions had been disorganized and their combat effectiveness massively reduced until the new troops could be properly trained. The brigades were lightly equipped, they lacked armour and artillery, and were not ready for anything as complex as an amphibious operation along the Norwegian coast. The French had also allocated forces to Scandinavia, elements of the Chasseurs Alpins and the Foreign Legion. The Chasseurs Alpins were expert ski troops, but unfortunately a quartermaster had forgotten to pack the straps, which attached the skis to the boots. In the weeks following the Altmark incident, Hitler received many reports that Britain intended to mine Norwegian waters and occupy Norwegian ports. On the 2nd of April, he announced that Weserübung would be launched at 05:15 on the 9th of April. Between the 3rd and the 6th of April, transport and tanker groups set sail from Germany's Baltic ports. And then in the early hours of the 7th of April, Admiral Leuchens gave the order for Gneisenau to rendezvous with the battlecruiser Scharnhorst and 10 destroyers carrying 2,000 troops for Narvik. Also at sea were the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 4 destroyers with 1,700 troops for Narvik. They steamed north in steadily worsening weather. Battered by a westerly gale, the destroyers had difficulty maintaining the 26 knots set by Gneisenau. As dawn broke on the 8th, 3 of the destroyers had become separated from the convoy. Meanwhile, at Scapa Flow, reconnaissance reports indicated that enemy warships were sailing north at high speed along the Norwegian coast. To Admiral Forbes, all was clear. They would skirt the Norwegian coast and then drive west, breaking out into the North Atlantic. The chance for the big all-gun battle had come at last. Forbes ordered the troops already on board cruisers and destroyers for Operation R4 to disembark, and then sent the home fleet racing northeast, chasing the tail of the German task force. He also alerted Admiral Whitworth aboard the battlecruiser Renown, which was off Narvik and sailing south along the Norwegian coast, directly towards the German convoys, to be on the lookout for a German attempt to break west. Forbes had the German fleet in a vice, but he didn't know it. The first encounter between the fleets was accidental. One of the Renown's escorts, the destroyer Glowworm, had become separated from the rest of the force on the 6th of April. Shortly after dawn on the 8th of April, about 100 miles northwest of Trondheim, she blundered into the destroyers Hans Ludemann and Arnim, also out of contact with their task force. For nearly an hour, in mountainous seas, the destroyers exchanged ineffectual fire, which brought the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper into the fray. Hipper's salvos brought down Glowworm's foremast and the radio aerials. Recognizing that escape was impossible, Glowworm's captain, Lieutenant Commander Broadmead Roop, closed on Hipper and launched 5 torpedoes, all of which missed. Hit again by an 8-inch shell, Glowworm fired her last torpedoes and then swung directly for Hipper. Plunging through the waves at 20 knots, the 1,300-ton destroyer smashed into the starboard hull of the Hipper, ripping away some 130 feet of armor plating and her torpedo tubes. As Glowworm fell away, Hipper's guns raked her. The Germans managed to pluck only 31 survivors out of the freezing, heaving Norwegian sea. Though heroic, the battle between Glowworm and Hipper indicated that the Royal Navy's command and control was poor. having picked up a brief radio signal from Glowworm, Forbes raced ships to the location. Failing to make contact, Forbes concluded that the Germans had turned west. Apparent confirmation was soon to come. During the afternoon, the German Trondheim group had reached its objective, but changed course several times while it waited for the appointed hour, 05:15, the following morning. A British aircraft, seeing it tacking to the west, radioed the news to Admiral Whitworth aboard Renown. The battlecruiser and her accompanying destroyers now raced off westward, leaving the approaches to Narvik clear. Upon receiving the same message, Admiral Forbes, 120 miles south of Trondheim, also veered westward. Having trapped the bulk of the German Navy, the home fleet now released it, speeding away in search of its elusive big gun battle. At 0400 on the 9th of April, Renown at last stumbled upon Gneisenau and Scharnhorst and opened fire, destroying Gneisenau's main fire control equipment. Leuchens sped off northeast, covering his trail with a smokescreen. He had no desire to hazard Germany's big ships. Besides, their job was done. They'd safely delivered the German invasion force to 5 points along the Norwegian coast, something that was just beginning to dawn on the British. At about the same time, on the morning of the 9th of April, 2 companies of Fallschirmjäger were over Denmark. The subsidiary operation Weserübung Sud was underway. Paratroopers seized the vital Vordingborg road bridge, the gateway to Copenhagen. Meanwhile, other paratroopers seized the Danish Air Force's major base at Aalborg on the Skagerrak. An equally spectacular coup took place in the heart of Copenhagen. German troops swarmed out of the hold of the cargo ship Hansestadt Danzig and secured the citadel, along with the Amalienborg Palace, the king's official residence, both without resistance. As Danes woke up to a German occupation, paratroops were dropping onto the Norwegian airbase at Sola, near Stavanger. Norwegian troops opened fire, killing many paratroopers before they hit the ground. Me-109 escort fighters operating at the limit of their range strafed the airfield, which allowed some of the paratroopers time to complete their drops, collect their weapons, and form themselves into assault units. Stavanger was the first ever opposed parachute drop. The Fallschirmjäger had achieved their objective, but casualties were heavy. All along the Norwegian coast, German amphibious forces were now approaching their disembarkation points. The transport Roda, carrying Luftwaffe personnel and anti-aircraft guns to Stavanger, was sunk by the Norwegian destroyer Sleipner. Admiral Hipper and her escorts had a less eventful time, entering the harbour at Trondheim at 05:25, completely surprising the undermanned coastal batteries. At Bergen, the cruisers Kohn and Königsberg, heading a force of 2 transports and 8 small torpedo boats, bluffed their way past batteries by signalling that they were a British task force. At Narvik, Commodore Bonte, leading the destroyer flotilla in the Wilhelm Hyde camp, entered the harbour and sank the guard ship Eistvold. Meanwhile, the destroyer Anim, threading her way through the shipping which packed the harbour, torpedoed the Norge, which exploded into flame, rolled over, and sank. Gripped by general panic, the Norwegian garrison slipped away. Meanwhile, far to the south, the heavy cruiser Blucher, accompanied by the pocket battleship Lutzow and light cruiser Emden and 13 smaller craft, had entered Oslo Fjord at about 0400. An hour later, as the Germans were slipping past Drubak, where the fjord narrows to only 600 yards, Norwegian batteries opened fire. Blucher, hit in the magazine, exploded. She capsized and sank with a loss of over 1,000 men. HE-111s now roared down on the batteries. Norwegian Gloucester Gladiators intercepted the first waves, but were shot down themselves by Me-110s. Other Me-110s landing on the runway of Oslo Airport used their machine guns to cover a drop by paratroopers. More and more Ju-52s arrived via Aalborg until a brigade had landed. The Germans then marched into Oslo, where Captain Spiller, the air attaché at the German embassy, told